the Development Bank of South Africa, the Group Executive for Project Preparation, we have Ms. Catherine Koffman. And of course, from the Infrastructure South Africa, we have Mr. Peter Gent, who will be one of our contributors. From the Public Investment Corporation, we have the acting head of unlisted investments, which is Ms. Luyanda Kali. And from the Black Business Council, we have one of our contributors being Mr. Sandile Zungu. Welcome. And so I guess to certainly kick off this conversation, the format of the conversation this afternoon, it will take the format of we will give 10 minutes, an opportunity for 10 minutes for our panelists to be able to give their contributing remarks in relation to their thoughts and their experiences, given the organizations that they represent and what it means for infrastructure financing, given the projects that have been tabled here today. And of course, after that, we'll give an opportunity for our contributors as well to make their contribution from an opening remarks point of view. Then we'll facilitate a conversation that will dig deep into some of the themes that are quite pertinent where the practicalities are concerned. Project preparation, instruments for financing, public-private partnerships, municipalities, and the practical considerations that are associated with all of those. And of course, we'll give an opportunity for the floor to also make their comments, put forward their inquiries, and of course, give, what's most important, the recommendations around how we can give practical expression to some of the associated goals that we have here this afternoon. And so the first panelist that I would like to invite to the floor from 274 Investment Managers, Ms. Fatima Vawda, who has indeed prepared a presentation as part of her opening remarks. Ms. Fatima,
thank you so much. If I can just ask for the presentation to be loaded. Okay, perfect. So I thought that, we've had lots of discussions this morning from Dr. Jose Ramagopa, from the President, from Minister Patricia de Lille, and I want to speak today from a pensions perspective and bridge the gap between the expectations of Infrastructure South Africa and having feet on the ground and understanding what pension funds are looking for from the perspective of making an investment into infrastructure. So I thought, it's an area that I've spent the last 2 decades in, so I understand the area quite well. And as such, I'd like to provide you with those insights into the pension sector, what some of the issues are, and perhaps that will help policymakers as well as Infrastructure South Africa to think about how to cross some of those challenges to be able to lure retirement fund investment into infrastructure. Then the emphasis is also on sustainability, and as Dr. Ramagopa mentioned this morning in his engagements with the retirement fund sector, a topic that keeps on coming up is ESG, is impact, and I will touch a little bit on that as well. And I may need a little bit more than your 10 minutes that you've, and I hope the other panelists don't mind. So I've prepared a few slides, and I will focus on the pension sector and the savings sector, as well as touch base a little bit on the issue around responsible investment, impact investment, and ESG from the perspective of an asset owner. So I thought this slide is quite important because it provides you with an indication of the level of capital that is available in this pool of assets here. So this graphic provides you with the total size of the South African savings industry, excluding banks, medical aids, and short-term insurance. So I believe, the size of banking stocks is potentially another 5 to 6 trillion rands. But if we just look at the numbers on the screen, we show shy of around 10 trillion rands if you add all those numbers up, which is basically the retirement fund sector together with the Public Investment Corporation, and that number was taken from their recent annual report as at, I think it was the 31st of March, as well as the stats of the long-term insurance industry and the retail savings collective investment schemes industry. So what you can see is that we're all aware of the fact that South Africa has got a very large, a fairly sophisticated financial system. We also have a very established retirement fund system. In fact, relative to GDP, we fall within the top 10 countries globally in terms of our pension system. And over the years, the structure of the retirement fund industry has evolved quite substantially. And if infrastructure investment is going to become a part of their portfolios, one has to understand the way the industry has evolved over the past decade in particular. So what we've had an increase, defined benefit funds. In the old days, we had quite a few defined benefit funds. Now, majority of the funds are defined contribution funds, and any kind of differences between pension and provident has also dissipated with the new regulations that have come into play. It's also important to note that the industry is highly concentrated in the hands of a few public sector funds, commercial umbrella funds, and bargaining council retirement funds. So we have the bulk of the industry concentrated in those a few types of funds, and then we've got a tail of smaller standalone independent funds. But over the past decade, there's been a strong migration away from standalone retirement funds into umbrella types of arrangements, and those have been done on the back of perhaps economies of scale, reducing costs, or a governance-related issue. So the current size of the retirement fund industry outside of the Public Investment Corporation is sitting close to 3 trillion rand. So you can see that first bar on the left. The third bar is also a very important bar. That's the retail savings industry, and the assets are pooled into what we call the collective investment schemes industry. And that's also a pretty big industry. There's a bit of double counting because some retirement funds do invest under collective investment schemes. But if one is to consider infrastructure investment, one has got to understand the regulations around all those different types of investors, as well as their objectives, their goals, their investment strategy. So if you look at the large standalone retirement funds, they have very, very specific objectives, which is to meet their long-term liabilities. Now, currently the long-term liabilities are typically matched with the use of instruments such as inflation-linked bonds, etc. Infrastructure, with its very predictable cash flow profile, and given that the big funds invest for the long term, infrastructure could be the perfect instrument or investment proposition to match those long-term liabilities and be very suitable for those type of retirement funds. But if we look at, for example, the life insurers, they also have various regulatory requirements under SAM, the solvency requirements, as well as policyholder assets. So life insurers have typically been strong investors in unlisted assets such as private equity and infrastructure as well. Collective investment schemes, the regulations currently do not allow for infrastructure investment, so one cannot tap into that current 2.9 trillion rand that is in the third bar. So what is available is essentially the 3 bars. But I believe that perhaps legislation or discussions are underway to bring in unlisted exposure into the Collective Investment Schemes Control Act. So commercial umbrella funds, different from standalone umbrella funds, typically only invest in vanilla types of products because you have participating employers who make their own decision on where and how they want to invest based on their employees and their membership profile. So it's incredibly difficult to get commercial umbrella funds to look at infrastructure outside of the currently packaged products that are available on the various menus of these commercial umbrella funds. Moving on to the next slide, and this is a very important slide because this shows how retirement funds in South Africa invest, and that is the average of all the big retirement funds, small retirement funds as well. We've conducted quite a bit of analysis in this space. And what you can see from this picture is that majority of retirement funds in South Africa, they are dominated, the portfolios of these funds are dominated in the listed markets. And we have very strong prescriptive limits under Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act, which limits the exposure to unlisted assets, currently sitting at 10%. Regulation 28, so the policy side of things, as Dr. Ramagopa spoke about this morning, the one pillar to enable infrastructure to take place is to look at how we can enable policy to allow that. And so Reg 28 was out for comment, and the initial proposal has been to increase the exposure of 10% to 15%, and comments have closed, so we're yet to see if that's going to happen. And so if you look at these numbers, you can see it's in the region of 2 to 3% that is exposed to unlisted assets, and typically those unlisted assets are either physical property or private equity, and very seldom it's exposure to infrastructure assets. Now, one has got to ask yourself the question, why is this the case? Because, the immunization of long-term liabilities is a core and critical function of any a large retirement fund. And as I said earlier, infrastructure investment has got those qualities in terms of predictable cash flow. So why hasn't it been used more extensively within our sector? Because if you look at the amount of capital that's available, and if we're looking to raise 1 trillion rands on top of the catalytic capital of 100 billion rands that the DBSA has, clearly the sector can just allocate 5% and South Africa wouldn't need to look elsewhere for that capital. So there are issues as to why this industry has not invested. And if we look at the members of ASISA, which is largely the asset management firms and the life insurance companies, the private sector has been very willing to invest in infrastructure and unlisted assets, and they've demonstrated this through the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program. They played a big role under that program. And if you look at the total there, currently the industry is sitting with around 2% in direct unlisted exposure. And the balance is through listed debt instruments, and those are listed debt instruments on the JSE. So the combination of unlisted and listed instruments has come to a total of around 6%. So unfortunately, the reality of the SA infrastructure conundrum is that there is not necessarily a lack of funding, because this is a big pool of capital. And we've identified a lot of projects, and those were identified and spoken about this morning. But what the private sector does worry about is how much of those are investable or bankable. And I think that's really the big issue. and we're really trying to facilitate those partnerships between the public sector and the private sector. And the private sector can come to the party with various things and have demonstrated that before, from technical skills and playing a role across the value chain. And balancing that risk equation is very, very important. And I think the private sector can play a very pertinent role in de-risking some components of the value chain of infrastructure investment. Whereas government can come to the party with blended finance vehicles and offtake agreements and de-risking with regards to any kind of political risk. I am going to wrap up soon. How do we compare with other countries? And this is important from an infrastructure investment perspective. So what you see here is that South Africa retirement funds globally invest a significant portion of their portfolios to unlisted assets. On average, between 20 and 30% of developed market portfolios are invested in unlisted assets. So we fare quite poorly from that perspective. And this was a global survey that was done by one of the largest consultants in the world. So most importantly, that's the South African component, the little orange bar over there. So you can see all the other countries have done quite substantial, on average around 26%. Okay, considerations for pension funds. I'm wrapping up 2 minutes. Is that okay? All right, so 2 minutes. So as you can see from this slide, we've identified a range of issues which will need to be unpacked and understood if we are to lure retirement fund capital for investment into infrastructure assets. I think firstly, we need a massive mindset amongst both the trustees of retirement funds. It's a case of knowledge, it's a case of learning and going through that process, the educational process, as well as the advisors and consultants to retirement who are often not equipped with the skills or the experience to evaluate these different types of investment opportunities. And that also presents a massive advisors don't bring forward anything alternative because they don't understand it, etc. So there is a skill in the pensions industry with regards to this type of investment. Another very, very important point I'd like to make is that sizes for infrastructure investment is very big. Now, as I said earlier, you've got this concentrated pool of very large retirement funds who can absorb large ticket sizes, but you've got those retirement funds that have a strong willingness to wanting to support the economic recovery process and participate in it, that are perhaps 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion, up to 10 billion, and they cannot access infrastructure investment because of the ticket sizes. Now, we can be very innovative around that, and a suggestion is that we would need a combination of all types of vehicles to make this happen, and we should be a lot more innovative in terms of how we can crowd in the smaller guys. I think, and I'm not going to talk on all the other issues, but the issue around concessional financing and blended finance is the carrot and stick, and you're going to kind of have to use that to some extent, because you will have to incentivize retirement funds to open their doors for infrastructure investment, and by de-risking it through the use of the blended finance approach is an ideal approach to catalyze this form of capital. And then lastly, as Dr. Ramagopa spoke about this morning, if we look at retirement fund policy and legislation under Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act, retirement funds have to consider the integration of ESG in their investment decision making. And so when they decide to buy an asset, they need to understand the real world impact of the asset. And that's further, the other legislation that supports that is Circular PF 130. And in 2019, the regulator released a guidance note on the sustainability of assets in a retirement funds portfolio, which again harmonizes and emphasizes the importance of the integration of responsible investment in portfolios. So another mechanism, we got to think beyond risk and return, and we got to think in the 3-dimension of risk, return, and real world impact, and not forgetting that retirement funds have got multiple sources and opportunities for investment returns. And what makes this so special? Are they going to get inflation plus returns? We have to consider lockups, gates, liquidity, all those types of issues. So apologies to our moderator. Too much time, but thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Fatima. Next up, I would like to request the opening remarks of Mr. Monale Ratsoma, the Director General of the African Regional Center at the New Development Bank. What are some of your thoughts from your point of view around solving for the projects and problems associated with infrastructure financing?
Thank you very much, Ndumiso, and good afternoon to those attending. And I understand there's also those who are virtually attending the session. I've got some notes here, but I want to pick up on Fatima's presentation because it is quite striking that there are so many resources in the system and so little of it has been dedicated to infrastructure. And it's even more relevant if you think of the type of infrastructure that the country currently requires. In any economy, when it comes to investment, the public sector would ordinarily have to take the lead. And that basically translates into business confidence, and the private sector would take, with some lag effects, a lead from that to start investing themselves. So in essence, it is unlikely that for the cycle that we are in, where government has to take the lead, that you will see private sector naturally shifting resources. So it means that then the government has to be taking a lead in how it thinks about its own priorities, in where first it gets resources for public-style infrastructure. When I say public-style infrastructure, I mean both at the national level and also that which is led by state-owned entities. It is a known fact that the fiscus is currently constrained. When I was looking forward to having the Deputy Minister here on the podium. So if the government is constrained along those lines, then how innovative does it have to be? I mean, institutions like ourselves, the NDB, the World Bank, be it IMF or the AFDB, were founded on the basis of governments looking to leverage their own resources. The NDB got a contribution of $2 billion from government of South Africa, which is same amount as all the other 4 member countries. In essence, that means you put in a rand and you want it to come back in multiples, right? You capitalize the bank and it gets a very good rating from the market, and on the basis of that is able to borrow, you blend the equity plus the debt, and ultimately you have a very reasonable cost of debt. What has lacked here is that there has not really been a strategic approach to how these resources have to be leveraged. Of course, in the last few years with the NDB, a bit of that has been changing. You've had Leslie Maltrop's contribution earlier on, to what extent the NDB has been involved, but we are not the only institution where government is a shareholder. Resources can be leveraged the same way from the AFDB, same way from the World Bank and everywhere else. But in turn, there's been a stigma against some of these institutions. You put in capital and you stigmatize and then you don't draw. For every cent you don't draw, you should understand that then it means you are essentially in some way funding infrastructure or whatever else in another country. I think we need to be paying attention as a government on that. And I want to bring in another aspect, which sometimes it enters the public fray and is withdrawn, and the need for a sovereign wealth fund. I say this because many countries across the globe that are underpinned by commodities, they tend to draw some of that when the cycle is favorable and plug it elsewhere. It cannot be that you save within your current account. And I'm saying that because all resources of government, they go into National Revenue Fund. From there on, then they will be dispersed, of course, as per the fiscal framework and the expenditure framework. So what needed to be happening, or what needs to happen is that in an environment where we've just seen where there was good commodity performance and therefore shorting the arm for government, some of those have to be plugged elsewhere. So what that does with the sovereign wealth fund that is born out of that is that you are able to ride the cycle using resources that were naturally generated for government. I mean, easy enough, correct? But you find that then in the cycle, when the cycles are favorable, there's revenue, then revenue will ordinarily then get spent. When the cycle turns, and of course that is in the spirit of a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, if you think of it, that when the economy is doing good, you slam the brakes a bit and take some of the resources and put that in your back pocket when the economy is struggling. So if you had those resources, it will mean that in an environment where the public sector has to be taking the lead in driving public infrastructure, knowing that ordinarily the private sector would follow, then you find yourself with a government that does not have resources to do so. And there are other contradictory aspects in there, which also are just ignited by Fatima's presentation, in how you think about just reserves of, let's call it reserves of the state, right? Reserves of the state. You would know the government runs an excessive, well not excessive, but a decent amount of reserves on any given day. If you track and trace where those reserves are invested, the very same place where asset managers are placing funds offshore, probably now, as per your slides, Fatima, at about 24-25% offshore. Most of those resources that are generated within here in South Africa are deployed elsewhere. In simple layman's terms, those resources are aiding with development elsewhere. Those resources are aiding with development elsewhere. I don't want to get into the details of whether, what type of asset class the resources are being invested. That 24% that's invested offshore is in essence investing in the development of another country elsewhere. So will be our reserves, and you may find and test that they are probably invested at 1% somewhere in treasury bills in the US or elsewhere. For that amount, in essence, it means that we're aiding development elsewhere. So we need a strategic approach to how resources, South African generated resources, are managed and invested. So my answer to some of the slides that I saw there is that we need to be thinking from a policy point of view how we really look at optimally things like Regulation 28. I think there's a clear letdown on how Regulation 28 is currently structured, and some of the regulatory provisions that go in parallel, that you have so much that ends up leaking elsewhere, and only 2% plus minus, we would say, is invested directly in infrastructure. I think that's a conversation that I understood to be happening. Maybe I saw Adre in the room here with ASISA and some of the policymakers here, and clearly they're not yielding the result as they should. Point here being that, yes, there are resources in the system. We are in a cycle where the resources shift, like a balance of payment. In balance of payment terms, we'll say that they are net savers in one place, therefore they are net borrowers in another. Even in a small economy, you'd find that in cycles, it has not happened here. The government is currently on the opposite side of the equation, right? They are net savers sitting with cash, but cash is deployed elsewhere. So we need to find, whether within the policy or within just conversation, call to action, whether that can yield redrafting and changes in some of the numbers as we have seen from Fatima. I'll pause there for now. Ndumiso.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Monale Ratsoma. Next, I would like your views, Ms. Catherine Koffman, Group Executive for Project Preparation. Clearly, there's evidence that suggests that the resources are there, But of course, we'd need to then look at it from a project preparation point of view, which was certainly highlighted earlier. What are you finding from a project preparation point of view? Are we creating a pipeline, therefore, of projects that are able to get these bankable resources, or are there specific challenges that you're finding in order to finance them? And if so, what are some of the avenues that perhaps you're seeing that we could be able to leverage in order to address some of those hurdles?
Thank you. I think that's it sounds like a specific question, but it's actually a broader theme in relation to what's been said. So project preparation, and I'm sure that those who have attended the SIDSSA so far would have heard about the work that's been done by ASISA, IF, and Project Prep from the DBSA and our other partners within government. And obviously the project owners of that pipeline being state-owned entities. There is quite a lot of work being done in Project Prep. Its importance is elevated because it determines the success of our delivery, our infrastructure delivery. But I think the themes that we're starting to see is a lot of the projects are big ticket items, because they're supposed to make a national impact really fast, which is important, but we also have to balance the fact that we've got, at grassroots levels, we've got entities that also need support and also need project prep support. And where do we fit in as DFIs and development banks in that role? In the BE space, the SME space, and in the infrastructure space, project prep, and this is for the funders. It's very easy for banks to fund BE in a project finance. I'm not sure why we don't do it more as development institutions generally. You've got predicted cash flows. You know, yes, you are a back leverage lender, but you still understand at which point you'd be paid. And if you play on both sides of senior and equity, you're probably doing really well. So I think if we could help, especially BEs at that level, become serious project developers themselves. RIP has been around for more than 10 years now, I think, and we still see the same suspects. We have developed a local economy now in this space, so we need to make sure that we support people at grassroots levels through project preparation funding. In terms of project preparation funding itself, we all need to understand, as was mentioned, the fiscus is constrained. And so we must apply project preparation strategically. As a state-owned entity, as a DFI, each DFI has a different role to play. They have different focus. So project prep should be provided to the DFIs to fulfill that role, project prep funding to fulfill that role. But we shouldn't duplicate each other's mandates. I think that's very important, because then you neglect the mandates that you have been actually created for. So for me, it's how do we collaborate, because we build up different skill sets in different DFIs. So how do we collaborate to accelerate development in the country, but still make sure that we're very focused on the mandates that we originally created for. As you know, I don't know if everyone's aware of that, but coming from a commercial bank originally, I used to be quite frustrated by some of the DFIs in the room, and now I'm one of them, that they don't provide the cheapest funding always. Sure. You know, why are they there, you know, when they're doing what we're doing? It's not you. So, and the reason is because they're actually not state capitalized. They go out in the market and they raise their own capital. So they go out to Nedbank, Standard Bank, RMB, and they get money from them. And you can understand that when they get in the room, who's going to have the cheapest funding, you know? So it's really important that we're really circumspect about how we spend project prep money, how we use funding that comes from the fiscus, like for instance, the National Treasury does provide project prep funding. In addition to project prep funding, the DBSA would go out in the market and raise itself. National Treasury does provide project prep funding specifically for the IF, But that is because there's a very strategic objective in mind with the IF and what we're trying to do there. And the other thing that's really, really important for me, and I hope I'm not going over time, am I good? Yeah, okay. Oh, okay. Is state capacity building. It's a really, really big issue for me, because ultimately you want to ensure that the owners of these projects can run these projects, are equal partners in transaction negotiations, in contract management. And for me, if you could come up with a program like that, that would be great. So that at some point we start to compete on skills with the private sector. In other words, they want our people vigorously. So really for me, that's a really important consideration. We've got so many other things to do at the DBSA that obviously no one's listening to me at the moment, but it is quite important, and I can see project prep funding, to spend it efficiently. We actually spend it probably more efficiently with private sector, because they have more capacity. Sure. They have more resources, so they do develop projects to a certain level. And because of that, once we get involved with them, the bridge capital that we provide, the technical expertise that we provide, we get there faster in converting that pipeline into projects that are bankable. So for me, that's an important part of this journey that has to be realized, that to improve our conversion rate, we have to work on all sides of the field.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Catherine Koffman. From the Industrial Development Corporation, Head of Infrastructure, Ms. Nina Yose. Your thoughts, please.
Thank you, Ndumiso. With regards to the IDC, in terms of what we offer, we do project development, as Catherine has mentioned, but with us, we do even earlier with regards to doing the BFS with the sponsors. In this instance, it's mostly the private sector. And here you will see that the risks are high, but the investment is generally very on the low end. For example, the SIDSSA project, Ms. Priscilla mentioned this morning, that one we're putting in 44 million rand for the BFS. So IDC basically wants to partner with the various private sectors to get the project development off the ground. And this will then de-risk the project, especially on the market side. Fatima mentioned the issue with markets and certainty of cash flows. So this project development, that's what it does. Once then we move from there, we then move to the project itself. And here you've got, the risk is relatively still high. You've got this whole construction risk, especially with regards to infrastructure, the tenure, how long it takes to put the infrastructure in place, and the capital investment is still high. So with IDC in this instance, what we provide, we do the debt, equity, as well as MES. And our tenure is anywhere from 7 to 15 years. We can go longer, but generally it's around 15 years. In the morning, Mr. Reg Demana mentioned the issue of inclusion, including the communities where the infrastructure is. When with IDC, we have what we call SME Connect partnerships. So how do we then partner these large infrastructures, companies that are going up with the local communities? And that's how you then also ensure that you've got social security around your infrastructure. We saw with the post-unrest, so with the unrest in KZN. So there we've got SME Connect, where we fund the smaller companies, entities, who then leverage off the larger infrastructure companies to then secure the market for them. And then we have what we call the operation and maintenance, that's now at the end of the project. That's still high investment, however, it's significantly de-risked, and there we've got the debt instruments that IDC puts in. With regards to where we play as IDC, we've got the logistics, telecoms, and water. With logistics, you'll see now Transnet has issued the RFI on the ports of Mocha as well as Durban. So IDC, we seek to support new entrants, especially BEE. So as IDC, we inclusive. Our money goes towards transformation with regards to women, Black industrialists and youth. So there we're looking at the people that will bid and win the bids and the BI's new entrance. So that's the ports. You've got the rail concessions that are coming up out of Transnet, as well as storage, cold storage with urbanizations, a lot of cold storage that's going on. So that's where we seek to participate. And then telecoms is a big feature as well within infrastructure. The business models are changing. You're seeing that some of the MNOs are wanting to offload the assets, the infrastructure itself, and they're just basically just selling the data and not really owning the infrastructure. And IDC, what we want to do is also to facilitate transformation in those sectors and put in the equity to support new entrants, especially historically disadvantaged individuals. I've mentioned SME Connect in terms of linking the small enterprises to the large projects. We also have the SEZs that we support, and that's district development that what we're seeking to look at, and within the SEZs. So what kind of infrastructure should be put up within an SEZ? So it's mainly utilities. Any investor, you want to be secure of your utilities. Electricity, water, and logistics, but you can't really look at SEZs outside municipalities. So once we then find the funding solutions for municipalities, policy certainty, we can then get the SEZs up and running such that we industrialize. We've got the factories up in those areas as well. ICASA, the broadband, moving from digitization. There we're also seeking to look at the wholesale access network, the operator, that will, for us, facilitate the provision of connectivity, internet connectivity to rural areas. And it's just how ICASA has structured their ITA, I suppose the last one, how they structured it such that it's almost free issue for the wholesale access network operator, such that they can then enable them with regards to cash flows and the bankability to then offer that service to the rural communities. But we've also seen at IDC in terms of, we're looking at supporting entrepreneurs who will be able to provide the connectivity to rural areas, because infrastructure, you can't really put large infrastructure in rural areas just by the way it's put up in terms of the spatial, because it's not as dense as the urban areas. So we're looking at new technologies on how to provide your connectivity to those areas. And with regards to challenges with infrastructure, you'll see that infrastructure generally not modular. It's high investment. It's not modular. Once you put it in, you can't then go take it out, right? And then there's also the issue of users. Once you've put it in, you need to ensure that the users have a quality service, and that's all about the regulatory environment that works around that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Yose. I think I would like to then take the remaining opening remarks to our contributors into our panel here this afternoon. I would like to firstly start with Mr. Peter Gent, who is from Infrastructure South Africa, to also give his opening remarks before we get into some of the key themes that have come out from our panelists here this afternoon.
I think I'm...
Oh, you might. Okay, great.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much. My name is Peter Gent. I currently work with Infrastructure South Africa, but I have to acknowledge that my background is investment banking. I spent 20 years working in the private sector in investment banking in the project finance arena. So perhaps some comments. I think in the 8 months I've been working at ISA, I've been looking very closely at the project proposals that have been arriving, and we see some themes. Clearly there are exceptions, but in terms of generalities, I think the concerns are, first of all, are the right projects being identified? So that really talks to the long-term planning within the government departments and the SOEs? Are they developing the long-term plans which will take the country forward? The second step is then, are they identifying the projects which are catalytic to delivering on those long-term plans? Because those are the projects where we really need to focus our attention. And then thirdly, are they actually assessing and evaluating those projects to the level and to the quality that will attract funding? And to be honest, that whether it's funding from the fiscus, or whether it's funding from the DFIs, or whether it's funding from the private sector, the same level of project evaluation is required. And we're seeing weaknesses in all three of those areas. And I think that's really a focus. As we've heard from a number of the panelists, there's not a shortage of funding, but there is a shortage of well-prepared projects, the right projects, delivering the right outcomes. And I think that's where government's focus really needs to be. What I would highlight is I think just as we are facing constraints in the fiscus, we are also facing capacity constraints within government. And the only real, just as in terms of our financial constraints, we are looking to the private sector to come forward and invest. Equally, we must seek the private sector's involvement in terms of those capacity constraints to assist government in terms of those very, very challenging issues that I've just discussed. I do think that it's been extremely disappointing for South Africa that since the heyday of the triple Ps in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, where we saw a plethora of triple Ps coming to the market, outside of the independent power producer program, we've seen virtually nothing since then. And one really has to ask the question, why is that? Certainly from the private sector's perspective, and let me wear a private sector hat for a moment, I think the expectation of government, or where government can really contribute in this regard, is first of all to ensure that government departments are encouraged, if not urged, to actually consider public-private partnerships when they are looking to develop their projects. I think the days of just being able to go to the fiscus and say, please fund my project, should be over in South Africa. I think where a project can attract private sector funding, where it can even more attract private sector participation, it should be mandatory that happens. The second issue I would say is that government controls policy. That is the role of government. And what we see are a number of areas where policy is substantially holding back the development of projects. And I mean, we can quote numerous examples. I mean, the issue around road tolling, the issue around the allocation of water rights, and on and on and on. And government really, if government is to motivate or if is to drive infrastructure development, it must address these policy issues, and it must address them as a matter of urgency. The third issue I think that government can really support infrastructure development is giving clarity and certainty around process. So, as has been highlighted, infrastructure projects are large projects. The level of investment into the assessment and development of those projects is substantial. My experience is the private sector is happy to carry the technical risks around that. They're happy to carry the risks of evaluating the technical issues facing those projects. The risk they can't carry is a process risk, where there is not clarity around the process that is being followed by government, where there is uncertainty, where there is vacillation in that. By providing that certainty, there is no doubt we will attract more private sector involvement. And then I think the last area that I would highlight is government have many agendas to fulfill, and we accept that, and I think that is a challenge for every government. But I think where South Africa finds itself today, we have to focus on driving economic development. We have to focus on getting infrastructure built that will allow the economy to grow, that will allow individuals to be employed, or will address the unemployment rate, that will increase the tax base, that will allow then the government to address many of the social programs that are required. But if we try to add too many agendas to that issue of driving economic development, driving infrastructure development, what will happen is that nothing will happen. And actually, none of those agendas will be addressed. So I think within government, the prioritization of that agenda is so critical. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peter, for those contributions. I would like to move on to the Black Business Council, Mr. Sandile Zungu, to get your initial and opening thoughts around this particular discussion.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I just want to stand here.
Of course.
First of all, thank you to the organizers for seeing it fit to include the voice of black business in this very important discussion. My remarks will be very short. You know, what are we building infrastructure for? It's very important to ask that question, because we don't just build infrastructure because Europe is doing it, because America is doing it. The case for infrastructure is quite compelling in South Africa. But what I would like to push is that we have to build infrastructure that, among others, supports the rebuilding of our industrial capacity. And when we do that, we do it in an orderly fashion that ensures that we secure the gains as we move forward. Unfortunately, in South Africa today, that is not quite happening. If you start from the remark made by Serame Taukubong in the morning, or in the plenary, where he says, for the telcos, we are rolling out infrastructure for 5G, for South Africa to participate fully and meaningfully in the fourth industrial revolution. But at the same time, we've got to deal with social challenges. Batteries are being stolen. And that does not send a good message to those who are being required to invest in infrastructure. The mining industry, where I'm heavily involved, we are experiencing a new boom, reminiscent of the super cycle. But we're not, once again, going to take full advantage of it. Why? Because the criminals in the non-ferrous metal recycling industry are robbing the transit infrastructure dry. So we're working backwards. We have to talk about these wild ideas to invest in infrastructure for smart cities, but we're destroying old cities. We're destroying the old economy. So another very important figure I picked up yesterday is that there are less people involved in manufacturing in South Africa, employed in manufacturing in South Africa today than there were 40 years ago. I still have to test it. I just had it in passing. It worried me, because here we are in South Africa saying we're steaming ahead when I be a services industry. We are actually forgetting where our strength is. When I invest heavily in renewable energy, but we've got 300 years of coal reserves where we should be, instead investing heavily in cleaner technologies in coal. Very much the same way that the Russians and the French, after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, said, look, there's so much negative energy around nuclear, but they invested on infrastructure and R&D for safer nuclear. Now nuclear is seen as a panacea to the energy crisis that the world is facing. How quickly the world has changed, 40 years, but someone had the foresight to invest in the technology and infrastructure that supports the strength. We should not be doing this thing of abandoning our strengths as South Africa. So investment, among others, I'm emphasizing here, among others, for recreating our industrial capacity. Now, the issue of inclusion is very important. There are many great ideas that come out of South Africa from time to time. We've got waves of, super intellectual thinking. But what is a common thread among all these super waves of great thinking is exclusion. We don't go out of our way to include those that are historically left out, and who are not left out because they wanted to be left out, who are left out because of decades and centuries of deliberate and objective exclusion. So I like the thought of the likes of IDC, DBSA, exploring the idea of, funding bankable feasibility studies and incorporating those black industrialists who want to be involved in project development. It's beautiful. But I think it needs to be done in a more calculated, in a more deliberate fashion, because the biggest bugbear for black business is access to capital. Unless we can make that available, their complaints will sound like a scratch record. And they will sound very petty, because they're saying the same thing that they said 20 years ago. We do not have rich uncles. We do not have parents who left us with inheritance. We cannot leverage on anything. Possibly the most valuable, prized asset that I have is the granite on my grandmother's grave. So we've got to think very deliberately how to ensure that we include, whether it's black people, whether it's women, whether it's young people, because we cannot allow this wave of rebuilding our infrastructure to pass us. We cannot. I think the propensity for South Africa to be patient also wears very thin. So that's one of my remarks. It's very nice and very comforting to know and to hear this said repeatedly, and the numbers to back it as well, that South Africa is not short of capital. No, I thought I will say that as an entrepreneur, because I would have started without any access to capital. I've built something. Maybe one is an outlier. But most of the people want that capital. They may not have the brightest of ideas, but they want to build off someone who has come up with an idea, and they want to project lead it, or they want to participate in it only if they can put something on the stove. And that something on the stove is capital that they can get from somewhere else. Without that, sorry, talk your good English, but you are left outside. You'll be left out. So that issue of inclusion, in my opinion, facilitator, program director, Hadebe, is a very important one. The issue of the sovereign wealth fund is critical. It's critical, and people have tended to shy away from it, simply because there's a narrative that says anything left in the hands of South African bureaucrats will possibly go down the tube. And so people have said, no, South Africa must not establish a sovereign wealth fund because probably they will mismanage it. But it's an important intervention for a nation state to come up with that sovereign wealth fund. I mean, look, the resources are pumping right now, and the state has got capacity to participate in that, and using resources, whether it's dividends, to channel towards the sovereign wealth fund. There will be bad times when we've got nothing happening for us, but where instead of continuously saying the PIC. PIC is not a sovereign wealth fund. It's someone's lifetime savings, a civil servant. That is underpinned by the state does not mean that we have a right to blunder it. Establish a peculiar fund, sovereign wealth fund, using resources which can then fund these projects as well as make it possible for those who are excluded to participate meaningfully, as well as fund projects which are not proven as concepts at any stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kwapini. Next up, I would like certainly last but not least, the contributions from Ms. Lusanda Kali, who's acting executive head of unlisted investments at the Public Investment Corporation. Yeah.
Okay, afternoon, everyone. And thank you also for allowing PIC to participate. I think I'll probably be the shortest speaker because everyone has covered all the aspects. And the last speaker has even kind of taken care of us and said PIC is not the solve-all. Okay, so I think from the PIC perspective, I wanted to firstly just confirm with everybody that the case for infrastructure is undisputed. Not only does it provide the financial returns that investors are looking for, but it provides the social returns that we're looking for as a country. So it's just the perfect sector to drive quite a number of the objectives that we have, both from an investment point of view, but also from a country objective point of view. The second part is the availability of funds. You know, I mean, it's been confirmed that there are funds available for this because of its characteristics, what it does for investors, how predictable the cash flows are. So, and we've seen that in programs that have taken place before. Even now, with the current renewable projects coming in, we can see that influx of funding coming through. So indeed, the funds are available and there is proof of that. The requirement for it as well, it's clear. We need the infrastructure to be able to be the backbone of the development of the country, you know, to be able to move any good from any place to any other place. You need the roads, you need the rail, you need the ports. So it's undisputed, the requirement for it. So then you think, so what's the problem? And I think it's been said so many times that basically we want it over here, we've got the funds over here, but you need to bridge the gap. You need the projects that are fundable. And, you know, getting to that stage is actually quite a long journey from the idea and putting up all the funds and all, not just the funds, you know, to get it bankable, but all the permitting, the licensing, everything that goes along with it to get it to a stage that now is ready for investment. And I think for us, that's where we see this whole program. It is bridging that gap. It's bridging that gap, bringing funders together who are able to fund the early stage. So DBSA, IDC, and other parties who are able to fund that early stage before bankability, and then bringing through all the different government entities who need to ensure that projects are moving, they are getting the approvals. You know, policy is going the right way to be able to enable the projects to work. And so for us, the big expectation is that strong pipeline, because once that pipeline is there, the projects are there, we then can bring in our resources to enable those projects to get up. And so that's why this is very exciting for us, because that strong pipeline is what we need to show to our clients. I mean, our clients are pension funds, it's insurance, they want this type of product. As I said, it meets their financial objectives and it meets their social objectives. And then I think then if I can just describe how we participate as PIC. So our largest business is the listed space, and then that has its own controversies. But in that listed space, we still participate in infrastructure because we fund the bonds of the state-owned entities. So SANRAL, ESCOM, so we've got funds invested in there to enable that infrastructure to be in place. But then in our space, which is the unlisted space, how do we participate? In the unlisted space, I mean, I think we heard about all the programs in the late 90s, 2000s. We participated in all of those, the PPPs, the roads. We still participate in ports, and more recently in the renewables. So we've participated very strongly in all those programs, participated directly for our own book in debt and equity, but we've also funded BE participants, so project sponsors, and we've also funded community trusts, so the communities in those areas. And this really comes from the developmental policy that our clients have. So we want to get the financial returns, but in the social returns, very strong around job creation and job retention. You spoke about capacity. Definitely, we are pro capacity, maintaining the capacity that we have and creating new capacity. So not forgetting about, the mines that still have to go on for long, but they just need the cash to be able to be maintained and still produce. And then also just transformation. And this is an area that we're definitely growing in. I think obviously there's been the complaints around, a concentrated BEE and not it spreading. We're going very strongly around triple BEE, more inclusive across the different diversity pools, so gender, color, rural, urban, etc. So that's really coming along very strongly. So I think that's probably it that I wanted to confirm, but definitely we are very pro infrastructure funding, a challenge that we have, and I think we continue to maybe talk to our clients, but also get the parties who can. We have limitations about how early we can go in the process. So at this stage, we can't participate pre-feasibility, and that's the space that IDC and DBSA play in, and Infrastructure South Africa. But the closer you get to bankable feasibility, then we're able to come in very strongly. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Kali, Head of Unlisted Investment at the Public Investment Corporation. Now, a lot of thoughts have been shared around a response in solving for some of the challenges that are associated with making some of these projects actionable and on the ground ready. And in a recent working paper that was recently published by the South African Reserve Bank in relation to fiscal multipliers, I found the following suggestions, rather findings, become quite interesting in light of this conversation. And some of these findings read as follows: that there's strong evidence of strong business cycle effects, such that in this particular study, the average multiplier in investments that were being studied in this context were below 0.5 multiplier. Although at the same time, these particular investments would reach a multiplier of 1.2 during recessions, and credit volume would diminish during periods of positive output gaps, but expands otherwise. So in other words, they're saying that this therefore suggests that a fiscal spending expansion crowd out private economic activity in good times only, whilst it holds positive balance sheet effects on liquidity constraints agents during the bad times. And I think given the context that we're located in right now, where we are trying to solicit an economic recovery plan that will drive growth and development sustainably in the long term, these kinds of collaborative efforts where financing is concerned of infrastructure therefore becomes quite important. Now, leading to the very pertinent question: what are the relevant or the applicable modalities to make this thing happen? I think it is well established from our panel here this afternoon that financing is available, that work is being done, and work still needs to be done from a project preparation point of view. There have been discussions around the Sovereign Wealth Bank, the SWF, and of course BE financing and inclusion, and of course partnerships that relates to public-private partnerships, and in order to be able to drive the execution and the success of some of these investments. But I would imagine, Ms. Fatima Vawda, I would certainly like to then get your thoughts in terms of what are some of the models or the mechanisms that would enable this private sector participation in some of the projects that have been outlined, for example, in this year's symposium, in order to ensure that we're able to drive that, but also what does it look like from a project preparation point of view to be able to lend that capacity such that it was one of the themes that came out in terms of ensuring the accelerated pipeline of very good bankable projects that, of course, could speak to a number of things, either commercially viable or need some de-risking or public financing as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, Infrastructure South Africa a moment ago mentioned that the coordination is kind of missing. So that gap in between does exist in terms of there's a willingness on both ends to participate, but there's something missing in between. So I think we need to improve on the coordination. And then coming to the models, you know, we like the idea of what the DBSA has done and what Infrastructure SA has done through the 100 billion rand allocation to catalyze a potential 1 trillion against it. And that is quite exciting because I think, you know, what do investors at the end of the day look for? They look for investment returns, they look for impact, and the ability to leverage. And all those three can be ticked off through using the blended finance approach to lure investors into infrastructure investment. And it's been demonstrated time and time again in developing nations that the model does work to create long-term sustainability, and as you've indicated a moment ago, behave as that buffer, particularly when times in the economy are tough. And that was also shared this morning by Dr. Ramagopa, where he demonstrated why is the US spending $2.3 trillion on infrastructure spend. It's for that very reason, to re-stimulate the economy following COVID. And it does behave as that real anchor during recessionary periods and those type of environments. But we've got to get to the point to what is it going to take for an investor to come to the table and say, right, we're happy to invest. So we've identified that the project bankability is important. We've identified that we need to connect some of those dots in respect of coordination. But I also think we need to be a little bit more focused in terms of what should you know, come to you know, commercial funders, etc., which projects and how that is going to work. So I think a bit of coordination is going to help. That's just what I'm seeing from my perspective in terms of a bottleneck. And then I do support the approach of using a blended finance model because we've seen it work. National Treasury, for example, have for years utilized such a model in their jobs fund, and they've been incredibly successful at crowding in capital through participating either as a guarantor or taking the first loss tranche, or incentivizing through return enhancement. And they have facilitated a number of projects over the past couple of years where they've in fact created a significant amount of jobs and participated in economic growth. And so it has been demonstrated and it is a means, but all investors are exactly the same. They look for the same thing. And so someone else said that earlier. So we need to make sure that we tick all the boxes there. But also if you're an investor and you've got this broad array of investment opportunities, why should you go this way? So you've got to deliver what investment returns.
Thank you for that. Catherine, in terms of from a project preparation point of view, what kind of models are you seeing coming through in terms of the pipeline of projects that are being tabled versus the ones that are indeed bankable, the ones that are not necessarily bankable, and what are some of the models that you're seeing actually working that also mitigate against some of these risks that have been highlighted this afternoon?
Thank you. Fatima, actually all the questions that the other stakeholders asked are quite interesting, and those are separate, you know, talk shops for another where we can debunk and see how we can solve those problems. But I think the big theme from both Peter and Fatima is coordination. Coordination is key for investor certainty and policy certainty. And I think the SIDSSA, the programs that have been accepted by SIDSSA into the IF pipeline, which include the National Water Program, the student accommodation, even SA Connect, we hope to get there. And as my colleague from IDC was speaking about the ICT sector, how we can support people at grassroots, contractors, emerging contractors at grassroots level in that program would also be great. But we shouldn't wait for programs, but I'm saying in terms of coordination, programs is a good way of having that multiplier effect, bringing in the blended finance, and the blended finance structures that the teams are coming up with are quite exciting. I can spend a lot of time on that because it's my happy place structuring projects. But no amount of structuring will help until you get that coordination right. And I think we have to learn from the past, but we also have to grow up from the past. The PMO structures, these programs will most likely all of them have PMO structures, which is a program management office, like the IPP office is a PMO structure. And that basically consolidates all these projects. I mean, the water reuse program on its own, just as one sub-program, will require quite a lot of coordination across the country. Many municipalities will be involved. So in order to speed up infrastructure to use our funds wisely, I think that's key, accessing PMOs. In terms of planning, I think what Peter also mentioned that was important around infrastructure plans that sometimes don't make sense. And I'm not sure that everyone's aware of it, but because most of our clients are actually public sector clients. Most of the other DFIs have private sector clients. And so our value chain in project prep starts with planning. There's an area within project prep that actually helps municipalities in the design and conceptualization of their infrastructure plans. And that moves across PPD towards the project development area, which eventually develops those projects into feasible projects that can be banked. But that's quite important, identifying plans that actually will make sense for the future. I have to say the one thing we haven't mentioned, but Sandile touched on it when he spoke about coal, is I can't comment on coal right now. I don't want to start a minefield right now. But I can say this, that the development and moving towards a sustainable green future are not mutually exclusive. In fact, the pools of funding that's becoming available to accelerate development is coming from green finance. And within that pool, there's also a pool that allows you to transition, even in respect of, well, suddenly don't get cross, but kind of dirty assets. I'm using this loosely. And so allowing you to invest in those type of assets is, with the intention, obviously, there has to be a genuine intention to move towards a greener environment. So I think we have to see where else we can get that cheaper funding, longer tenors that comes from doing blended finance structures and access that to accelerate development.
Thank you for that. Monale, coordination is clearly a very strong theme that's coming across. So regardless of whatever objective or project we want to get off the ground, we have to make sure that it firstly gets to the ground. In your view, is the district model one of the avenues that would be able to accelerate that, or are there any others that you think may be able to really deal with this question of coordination and, of course, the capacity as constraints as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of conversation about the district model, but I think to where Peter took us earlier on, the issues are much deeper. The issues are much deeper. And I think we are sitting today with the investment conference underpinned by ASISA. The starting point of this was last year in February, where a number of us at TNA's met with the president, and we were outlining just the deficiencies in the system when it comes to infrastructure. I think it was ranging obviously from pipeline not coming through, the quality of the projects, the borrower and the funders not meeting the policy bottlenecks and the hurdles is across the board. And I don't think that certainly a district model approach will just answer all of those questions that are fundamental to the issues within infrastructure. I think what is worth maybe focusing a little bit on, I mean, by now, I think everyone who has spoken has touched on many facets of where the issues may be and a number of different other solutions. And I would want to see myself out of this type of processes that things get unlocked, that I think the multiplier outcome begins to show up, that we don't then get stuck in this repetitive cycle of just complaining about who should do what, who is not doing what. I think that's essentially where we want to go. And I think we'd want to test even Fatima's numbers. It would be interesting to see, because I think there tend to be quite a bit of emphasis on public infrastructure in this conversation. And when we talk about where asset managers and financial institutions are plowing their capital, it'd be interesting to see if they have been plowing their capital in private-led infrastructure, if that doesn't have the same issues that are suffered with the pipeline that is coming through from the public sector. I think the one notion that I really hold quite dearly is that I think we need to be sensitive to cycles. I think I've touched slightly on this point earlier on, that the kind of cycle that we are in, the public sector has to do much of the heavy lifting. It is not going to happen by just the private sector or private funds suddenly changing mind and starting to buy into South Africa's story because we just had an investment conference. One other what we should perhaps challenge them is to come to the party if they feel that there is no pipeline on the basis of weakness in the development of project. Why can't they contribute to project preparation? They're probably making the most buck from the projects. I mean, my funding comes in probably on a 10-year at 3 months JIBOR plus, say, 150, 200 basis points. They are probably milking it on the extreme end. They tend to benefit the most. So if you've got such a high yield, if the project is well prepared, why can't you put in seed capital? What stops you from putting seed capital? I mean, the banks as well. The banks, they benefit throughout the institutional value chains internally, from the structuring to the executors to those who are going to ultimately hedge. The entire bank in its entirety benefits from this. Why are they not putting in the seed capital for project preparation? Why should it only be that we look to government to do the heavy lifting? And of course, I mean, government must, right? But what I like that is emerging, though, which I think should be a solution for how infrastructure going forward will have to be financed, is, I think Nina touched on it. There's quite a few state-owned entities that are starting to do off-balance sheet. I think for us, that is our natural business, doing off-balance sheet, either giving concessions, off-take, and sell, leaseback type of their assets. We are looking to support those. I think they address a number of issues, one of which would be counterparty risk. I mean, the two institutions, my left and right, I'm already exposed to them almost to the limit. If they come back to me for maybe a line of credit, I may struggle to still justify through my board to give them additional funds. So once you start looking at off-balance sheet, using off-take agreements or either power purchase, in water, then I think then we're starting to talk to business. I think there's one institution that is leading in that regard, because in all fairness, if we were to name institutions, if you say I must give Eskom funds on the balance sheet of Eskom, I'm not going to. I'm going to ask for a guarantee. And of course, then the guys in 240, Madiba, have issues about guarantees themselves. So that will sentence Eskom to not doing any business for the foreseeable future. So we need to be thinking about how many of these projects can be increasingly taken off balance sheet, learning from the REIPPs, of course, and extending beyond that. But I think the real challenge here is that capital at the moment is sitting with the private sector. How best can we nudge it? To be investing in infrastructure?
Thanks for that, Monale. Nina, I think it's been mentioned by a few of the panelists around the question of capacity, coordination, but I would think that even this drive of having an infrastructure-led economic recovery is not for its sake. The question of inclusivity and diversity is also mentioned to ensure that it's sustainable and inclusive in the long term. Given this question, and I would think that making investments or backing bankable projects is a function of the work that has been done prior to that, ensuring that there's a solid pipeline of these projects and the volumes are indeed scalable, given that it was also highlighted earlier that the rebasing of the economy requiring a 30% of GDP from a gross fixed capital formation point of view, in rand terms, it would need over 700 billion rands per annum. Now, it's a function of all of this good quality work that is being done prior, which of course you guys play an integral part in doing so. Are you seeing that happening? And if not, what more needs to be done? Or what are some of the opportunities that we can leverage in order to ensure that, in order to meet the fundamentals that Fatima mentioned, that investors certainly wanted the same things, in order to ensure that we're able to give that to them, what are some of the opportunities that we can leverage to really create that, such that the resources are indeed available and can be leveraged in this instance?
Thank you. So the theme from all the speakers today has been coordination. And I'm going to add to that, and I'm going to say information and standardization. Information, we know that sometimes can be very expensive to acquire. So for me, a program like ASISA, it really does sort of reduce that gap, the information gap. However, more can be done with that, as well as standardization. We know that whether it's sponsors, whether it's lenders, going through legal agreements, whether they're long or through processes, for example, bidders, like we said now, Transnet, there's the ICASA, just those processes and standardization. And I think we can learn and leverage from the reprogram, as well as TCTA, who's been doing this for a number of years. So how do we then leverage off those programs in terms of standardizing and standardizing our processes and reducing the information gap between the various parties? So for me, it's those things over and above, and that's what can possibly drive the pipeline. Thanks.
Thank you, thank you. I think at this point in time, I would like to take any comments and inquiries and any inputs from the floor, if there are any, by show of hand. All right, Simpiwe, there's a gentleman there in the center. An additional hand to note, gentleman at the back. Can you please introduce yourself, which organization you're representing, and of course you can make your input or comment or recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. My name is Gregory Mufokeng. I'm from the Black Business Council. Program Director, I'm trying to find a glimmer of hope, man. You know, some silver lining, some message of hope that we can take back to our members, to our people, man. I'm not finding it. I'm not. I see more confusion, more discord, and this is very worrying for us. Now, let me start first with the economic recovery and reconstruction plan that the President spoke about this morning. Central to that is infrastructure. Number two is transformation of the economy, right? On the infrastructure side, what we are seeing is that more and more money is now going towards other social programs away from infrastructure. To an extent that mundane projects like housing and schools and all of those things, social infrastructure that government should be funding directly itself is now moving towards, triple P arrangements, as it was reported this morning. So what are we seeing? We are seeing more and more construction players, for instance, that are supposed to be involved in the rollout of this infrastructure, creating jobs, not getting involved. So everyday companies are closing because government has shifted expenditure away from that into other social programs. Now we come here to understand exactly what ISA is doing in partnership with other funders to make sure that there's money that flows into all these other infrastructure programs so that our people can be busy. We want people to be busy rolling out infrastructure. Now, what I'm hearing from the gentleman from ISA is more and more challenges. There's a problem with this approval. That approval, it's a problem for us. We thought that there's an Infrastructure Development Act which makes it easy, for instance, to get approvals, EIAs, these water licenses and so on. The act is there. Why are the actors not sitting down and finding solutions? So we have a problem there. Number two, on the issue of inclusive growth and inclusivity as far as the economy is concerned, we need to make sure that as all these problems are being sorted out, more and more black players are accommodated. Now I want to cite two examples to show you the problem that we have. Number one, at ESCOM, for instance, ESCOM has deliberately, retrenched people who are looking after ESD programs. Now what happens is that big companies, big white established companies are now giving the smaller players who are black a raw deal. Who do we go to? Because the capacity that ESCOM had to monitor those programs is no longer there. Just yesterday, one of our members who is awarded a contract by one of the SOEs is now getting a raw deal from their white partner who signed a 50-50 joint venture, and then they come back after being awarded. They say, no, the person who signed that did not have authority. We are now giving you 10%. So how the state acts informs how we are empowered as black people in the economy. So we want to be clear that let the policies be direct, be clear, let there be inclusive growth and economic growth for that matter. And also we want, when the funding is arranged, there must be targets for BE, please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gregory. Thank you for those inputs. I think we'll put some of those thoughts to one of our panelists. A gentleman at the back who had his hand up, Simpiu, is that gentleman at the back also would like to make a comment or make inputs. Please introduce yourself, which organization you're representing, and you can give your input.
Sure, thank you. So my name is William T. I am in the private sector property development. I'm with a company that does property development in the private sector. And so my question relates to what Catherine touched on, and I think Fatima touched on it as well. What we're finding is, with regard to, call it, funds, we've been, over the past few months, been introduced to various impact funds, be it, let me not name them. Some are pension funds, some are obviously in the private sector. There's a reluctance to, everyone is offering debt, senior debt, and there's a reluctance to move towards equity. And everyone claims that they are now playing in the impact investment arena. But those terms at which that debt is made available, another speaker mentioned it, is often at higher interest rates than what a commercial bank can do, for example. So for me, it begs the question, at what point can impact, at what point can real impact begin to be achieved? And I think if you look at the returns that we sometimes table for the equity portion, some of them are actually higher than, we're looking at first year yields of 8.64%. And I mean, that's low, but that's because we're playing in the impact arena. So yeah, I think I've pretty much summarized. My question really relates, what is the reluctance? Is it because there isn't collateral in terms of a mortgage, or what is the reluctance, and how do we begin to move towards equity? Because that enables developers to roll out product, because banks are doing, gearing is at like 40 to 60. So there's a gap there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Is there perhaps a member of our panelists or a delegate who would like to respond to that particular inquiry? Impact investing and how they're structured for projects?
Gregory's question?
Gregory's question was certainly around the processes that are associated with inclusivity in these investments, particularly for allocations towards black players.
Yeah. I'm happy to touch on both a little bit. So Gregory raises a very, very critical issue around inclusion, diversity, equity, all of these issues, and particularly transformation in the rollout of the infrastructure plan. And I think where it actually comes down to is the infrastructure fund and how the infrastructure fund facilitates the level of transformation and inclusion that the industry requires, both in terms of the procurement of service providers as well as the channeling of the capital and the implementation and how that's going to be done. Because one of the things we've identified is that in the asset management industry, there are a significant amount of black private equity players who have positioned themselves as potential conduits for the rollout of this infrastructure plan. But it is not clear at the moment if the infrastructure fund are the only people that's going to do it, or will black service providers within the financial sector get an opportunity to play a role in that model. That's the first area. And then the second area is also on the individual transactions, etc., equity participation. And again, as Sandile has talked about, is that black people don't have capital, the amount of capital and balance sheets, etc. So hopefully, we're hoping that government is taking all of this into consideration. Also, what we also do find in the market is that particularly the industry bodies that a government then goes to take. So we've been, for example, told that Infrastructure South Africa or Infrastructure Fund will liaise to the private sector through the industry bodies. But unfortunately, the industry bodies are only representative of the very, very large players in the market. And, very little black participation or broader participation. So there's a form of natural exclusion that happens as a result of that. So we're hoping also that, the doors are a lot wider in terms of who communicates to who. In terms of I'll comment a little bit in terms of the property question. The capital raising cycle in South Africa for anything out that's alternative is incredibly long. So it's a 5-year cycle that smaller, independent, black-owned service providers, asset management firms, property investors, private equity players, etc. The typical capital raising cycle is in the region of 5 years. And that's what we've seen. I mean, we've seen, about 10 years ago, we had a lot of international DFIs that were very active in our market, the IFC and other guys and other players, but CDC, etc., they've all but disappeared. Maybe we'll see a re-emergence of them as a result of this infrastructure program, but it's difficult.
Thank you for that, Fatima. I think, therefore, then, in the interest of time, I would like to then give in fact, I think, certainly in the interest of time, I would like to give my panel the opportunity to give their closing remarks, given today's discussion. And I think we will take the closing remarks in the inverse order. So I think we will then, Simpio, can you kindly give a mic to Ms. Lusanda Kali to give her closing remarks with respect to the conversations and deliberations that we've had here this afternoon. Here she is. Ms. Lusanda, you can come to the front. If you so wish.
Okay. Yes, I think I've definitely taken the call for broader participation at the early stage, and this is an area that we continually engage with our clients. As I think Fatima said, there's different rules with the pension funds, what they can, what they cannot do. And it's an area that we are really leading with our clients to allocate some funds to the earlier stages, because indeed, infrastructure, they want a whole lot of exposure there. We like the sector, but there's a big dependency on others to prepare the projects and get them bankable and ready for us to invest. So it's an area that we work on and that we think in the maybe not immediate future, but medium term, we'll be able to at least go down a little bit. But definitely participating right now in the conversations with ASISA, Infrastructure Fund, and all our partners generally on the role we can play, which is very significant in funding infrastructure projects.
Thank you very much. So clearly, more and more conversations need to be had in this respect. I'd like to give Mr. Sandile Zungu from the Black Business Council to also give his closing remarks.
Thank you. You know, the 90s were the heydays of public-private partnerships. You know, just to remind those who were not exposed to it, like you said, hospitals were built. Albert Lutul in Durban. The national roads were built, which are still standing. They're the pride and joy of interprovincial travel. Prisons, no one appreciates those, but they provide a service. You know, we're back to that. We need to impress upon those who have got capacity to create a push, to nudge them to move faster. Because when we talk about the lack of trust or the trust deficit, can be breached through welcoming, opening of arms to include. The issue of asset allocation is something that needs to be looked at very, very carefully. We're obviously coming from an environment where there was a scarecrow of prescribed assets, prescribed investments. You know, take that noise away. You know, we need to allocate more resources towards private equity, towards the areas where infrastructure really belong. And that requires a mindset shift between government as well as ASISA and the Banking Association, among others. But let's not forget the fact that we need to include more people. This noise needs to be a cliche, but it can, I mean, if you hear the passion in Gregory, he talks for a constituency. And they feel excluded. They hear now we are talking about a new wave, excitement about investment, foreign direct investment. But when they look at asset allocation, all the money is going towards exposure to foreign listed assets. You know, how about excitement about investing in townships? How about excitement about investing in rural areas? How about excitement about rolling out infrastructure, real infrastructure for telecoms, where people are densely located? So inclusion and prioritizing on the needs for the country become very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sandile Zungu, for those very important closing remarks. Mr. Peter Gent, Infrastructure South Africa, can we get your closing remarks as well, please?
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I would like to say, I think there is good news. So for Gregory, I mean, yes, we are focusing on the challenges because we are looking to accelerate our movement forward. But I do think we have to take a moment to just look back and say, what has been achieved in the last 12 months?
Yeah.
And certainly, from my perspective, and I'm a relative newcomer into ASISA, I've seen a level of engagement with the government departments, with the multilateral funders, with the development finance institutions, with commercial funders, with private sector industry bodies, which frankly I think was absent in the past. So many of the challenges that have been mentioned today, I think there are concerted efforts to try to address these. And I'm certainly seeing significant progress in areas as diverse as agriculture, transport, water, sanitation, municipal development. I mean, every single one of these areas is substantial engagement, and we are seeing projects starting to emerge. let's be quite clear. Infrastructure projects have a significant gestation time, and the bigger they are, the longer that is. But is there movement and is there progress? Yes, I think there is. I certainly agree with your point that there needs to be focus. There needs to be brutal focus. If we are to address this infrastructure deficit which has been allowed to develop in South Africa, there has to be brutal focus in actually achieving that and driving through and overcoming the obstacles. But I'm certainly seeing a will to do that. And I think, you know, whether it's the development, whether it's the creation of an entity such as ASISA, whether it's the creation of Operation Vulindlela to address some of the policy issues, whether it's creation of the infrastructure fund to actively bring private sector funding into public infrastructure, I'm seeing very concrete steps. Is it enough? Well, I don't think it'll ever be enough. But do we have to focus and drive and work together to achieve this? Absolutely. Do I think we can significantly impact the proportion or the economic growth of this country through infrastructure development? Yes, I do. Do I think we can drive inclusive participation in the economy through infrastructure development? Yes, I think we can. Do I think we can encourage the private sector to invest in infrastructure in South Africa, right from the seed capital through to senior debt? Yes, I think we can. So I think these are all possibilities, and I think there are issues that are being addressed and progressed. But it does mean that we are going to have to work together. Because I promise you, the one thing that we can't afford is if we're fighting each other over these things. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Mr. Peter Gent. We have to work together. Ms. Nina, closing remarks, please.
Thank you, Ndumiso. So from the IDC's perspective is that IDC is open for business. We provide debt, we provide equity, as well as MES. Our funding seeks to transform and have redress in the economy, supporting youth, women, and black industrialists. We participate in early stage. As I mentioned earlier on, BFS stage, so we take early risk in projects. However, what I've picked up from today's conversation is that both from the lenders, the bankers, as well as the entrepreneurs and the sponsors, is that we really need innovative ideas around how do we mitigate risk, how we see risks, and making the projects more bankable. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Mr. Monale from the New Development Bank.
Thanks, Ndumiso. I think, to Gregory, there are certainly maybe opportunities at the moment that are borne by the cycle we are with the economy that can be leveraged on, i.e. the examples we're making when how certain entities are now looking at off-balance sheet solutions, and if they're going to provide off-take agreements on those, clearly I think that enhances any structure that can sit outside of the balance sheet on an SPV, on a project finance. I think those are worthy to be pursued by some of your members. I think we are coming across a lot of those that are making sense to us for potential exploration. So I think it is something that maybe you can just circulate the message that things are happening in the market. You don't want to be caught napping. I think the skin in the game issue has come through, that I think there are those that are players also in the infrastructure space. They have got no skin. They are waiting for, I don't know, manna from heaven to participate when all is well. And I think they should bring the skin in the game as well. As the NDB, we certainly are bringing very cheap funding in the system. Very, very cheap funding in the system. That's our skin in the game, has been mandated and capitalized by the state. On procurement issues, and I was kind of in doubt whether I should touch on this, but I think because we get this question a lot, and I've engaged with BBC before, arranged through the team there on the role of the NDB. You see, the success of the bank, and I will just go there nonetheless. The success of the bank in South Africa thus far, and even in other member countries, has been that it just was set up on the basis of not becoming anything like the traditional Bretton Woods system institutions, which come through and they will tell you that you should do X with procurement, you should do X with the environment, you should do X, and they assume that you've got nothing. So with a system like South Africa, where much of that is actually quite entrenched and developed across, you don't need an institution that comes and dictates. So you can operate on the basis that there are country systems in place, and definitely you can do your business latching onto those country systems. So that's how the NDB has been formulated, that they will rely on country systems, and of course, some basic principles will have to be satisfied. So this matters on the issue of procurement, because some would say to us, but why don't you, when you finance, dictate that X amount should go where, X amount should go. So we are successful because we are not doing exactly that. So we'll operate on the basis that the institutions that we finance are leaning on domestic policy that addresses exactly that. So if there's anything that fails, would be the domestic policy. So I think then it's a conversation about whether procurement policy in South Africa is built enough to support the previously disadvantaged or not. Sure. So it's clearly the case that constantly it is letting us down, right? Then we should then pay attention to that. We should be paying attention to that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Monale. Yeah, I wish the Deputy Minister was here. I think Ms. Catherine Koffman, from the DBSA's point of view, your closing remarks, please.
Firstly, I will have a coffee with the NDB about accountability when they allocate proceeds to those who lean on those proceeds on another occasion. I will say this, I really respond to the sentiments that Gregory raised. That talks to development.
Sure.
You know, we can talk about all the great plans in the world, but that talks to development. And I think that there is a correlation between the trajectory we were in the 90s, the space in between, and now. I will not be too vocal about what the elephant in the room is, but I will say this, that leadership is everything. And with the current leadership, the impetus coming from the highest office in the country as far as SIDSSA is concerned, and as Peter mentioned, the engagement that's happened between public and private sector, which we know has been missing for a long time. I believe the projects that we are looking at will unlock development and access to all. I really believe that. In terms of ensuring that those folks who need support when these projects come online, I don't think there's a bank, commercial or development, who doesn't recognize that. The commercial banks, having been there for a long time, we compete once we realize the market is focused there. We come up with ways to outwit each other to support that area if that is becoming where the money is going to come from. That's just a natural thing. As a DFI, we must step into the gap. If there's a gap, that's our job. We must step into the gap, and I think amongst all of us, I don't know what's happening in the corridors of the other banks, but certainly, I was at a strat session today at the DBSA. This is top of mind. How do we support our emerging contractors? And there are many ways of doing it. We won't go into that now. I think the reprogram, the standardization under the reprogram we can do better on economic development criteria. And we will take care of that for you. Okay, NDB, we'll make sure our, yes. So we must make our economic development criteria, our local content requirements much stronger, especially for the programs that are in the pipeline for SIDSSA. But generally, I still think there's still room to work on the stuff in between, even though we've got these big, audacious goals. Sure. There are projects that, we also have private sector players that come to us for project prep. And at project prep stage, we should be influencing who get access to that money, because they end up eventually at our lending desk where they are supported through the other funding products that the IDC mentioned, the senior maids, etc. So, yes, I mean, I think I'd like to give her some time to give her 2 cents.
Thank you so much, Ms. Catherine.
Can you see the collaboration happening here?
It's already happening.
And that's what we needed.
It's already happening.
So
yes.
I'd like to also corroborate what everyone has said, and a lot has happened over the past 2 years that cannot be ignored. You know, a commitment was made by government of 100 billion rands to the DBSA. There was no team at the DBSA focused on the infrastructure fund. They were capacitated, the right skills were brought in place, IF was put in place. The conversations are happening in the corridors of all the institutions. The discussions are happening at pension funds vigorously. There's a lot of energy, there's a lot of willingness, there's a lot of momentum, and I think we, you know, as South Africans, we're a resilient nation. We live with adversity every day of our life, and we will definitely take on the challenge, and I think we're going to see this through very, very successfully.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Ms. Fatima. I think we can give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you very much. This has been a very important, practical, and yet difficult conversations. Would have loved to get into some of the policy considerations that would support these kinds of investments from happening. But thank you to all of the delegates that are present here today. I think the common theme is that there's a greater opportunity for communication, for collaboration, and for ensuring that we're able to fill in the gaps as partners working together where the opportunities or where some of the difficult questions may lie. And in doing so, I think we certainly have that opportunity. I think just to close, there's a quote by, I think it's Advocate Tembeka Ngugaitobi, where he speaks about South Africa's infrastructure. So he relates this particular quote, I'm paraphrasing it, but I think it's timely for this conversation. He speaks about South Africa's fabric, or most nations rather, estimating their strength based on their physical infrastructure. But I think based on the quote that he was mentioning, he says that South Africa's strength, barring the physical infrastructure, lies in the soft infrastructure, being its people, our collaboration, and the partnerships that we're able to leverage with one another. And I think that given that the physical infrastructure aspects we've discussed at length and there are other opportunities that we can leverage there, I think now it's in the softer stuff, the conversations that are going to happen between Catherine and Monale post this conversation to be able to fill in those gaps. The collaborative efforts, some of the issues that Gregory has highlighted around inclusivity, and of course Nina as well, and Fatima's contributions, and Peter, and of course Mrs. Sandile Zungu and Ms. Kali as well in this room. So I think as we head out from this boardroom, we can have that in mind and get the conversations going. Thank you very much, and have a lovely and blessed day further. And I think you may head to the main conference room as we close the symposium today. Thank you very much. Travel safely. Thank you so much. Thank you, guys. Thank you.